Good day, everyone, and welcome back to AMI's Coffee Chat series. We appreciate those of you attending this week in spite of the fact that we had to delay things 1 week. That was really a function of Semana Santa and being able to organize around Semana Santa, as well as yours truly caught COVID, which certainly hampered my own productivity for a couple of weeks there. So thank you for joining us today. Today we are going to, as we've done recently with Ecuador and Peru, we're going to talk about this time Chile and the mining investment risk panorama in Chile, given the very busy electoral year ahead of it. First with the delayed Constitutional Assembly vote, which I now understand will take place in May, and the first and most likely second round of presidential and congressional, and half the Senate will be elected towards the end of the year, the first round in October, and the most likely, at least at the presidential level, second round for December. So a lot is at stake this year, as all of you know who operate in Chile, and I'm very pleased that we have put together this coffee chat and that our two esteemed guests are joining us. Before I introduce them, let me just quickly, if we could move Andres to the next slide. I'm being assisted by Andres Farge, who works in our mining practice. Very quickly, I want to point out that the views of all the panelists may or may not reflect the official views of the organizations that they represent. And the content of today's coffee chat, until we publish it, it is to remain private content, which means it cannot be reproduced or quoted without the express written consent of all panelists. If we decide to publish the recording of this, at that point, of course, you can. We have taken upon ourselves to verify any information that we will be sharing with you, but we certainly want to remind everyone to use multiple sources when making business decisions based upon today's webinar. Let's move on from there, please. Let me quickly introduce to you AMI. Most of you know who we are, but there's always some new people joining the coffee chat each month. So let me quickly tell you a little bit about our firm on the next slide. AMI itself has been around, was first founded under the term Info Americas back in 1992. So we've been around for almost 30 years now. And we've been heavily involved in the mining sector now for almost 20 years. And we work with clients really in two capacities. One is pre-investment, helping them with their due diligence, understanding the risks that are associated with investing in a given jurisdiction, but more and more really what worries people, where the value of above the ground risk is really measured, is closer to the mine. It's local stakeholders and understanding that environment, and that's really where we excel at researching that for people. And then as a mine moves forward through its different stages, there will be critical points in time where a lot of money is being invested, where stumbling blocks might be found, whether it's in the licensing or even during the production periods. And this is where our ongoing monitoring of risk, again, particularly local risk, can help contribute to a smoother operation of a mine. With that, let me now take a moment to introduce to you our esteemed guest today. Myself, John Price. We have Rony Zimerman, who has a really interesting background, having been born in Chile, raised formatively in Canada, earned his degrees there, but then moved to Chile and studied additionally, and has practiced law there for a couple decades, and runs a natural resource practice at Lembeye Abogados in Santiago. Rony, thank you for joining us. And Norman Gridley, who I recently met after our Peru coffee chat. And Norman Gridley is VP for Latin America, or is it all of the Americas, Norm? for Satarla, which is a risk consulting firm. And Norman has a really interesting background himself, having worked throughout the Americas in the mining sector and having resided in Chile in the last 15 years. Let's move forward and begin our discussion. Norman, if I may start with you, like I said, you've lived in Chile for 15 years. You've watched both from the sidelines and up close how Chile's mining sector has evolved, and with it, Chilean society's acceptance of mining. So in your mind, how accepted today in Chile is mining by some of the key stakeholders, local communities, other stakeholders near the mine, Chilean voters? How have miners had to adapt the way they do things to placate these stakeholders today versus the past? And what sort of potential collisions do you see ahead between any of these stakeholders and mining companies in future?
Thanks for the question, John. Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation. Great to be here. And also congratulations on your successful recovery from COVID. Glad to see you here. Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to respond to the question you raised. And I have thought about this quite a bit over the last few days. I would like to start, if you don't mind, by just going very high level almost from the investor side first, and then talk about the local situation second. At a high level, all the participants today probably know that there is the Fraser Institute review every year out of Canada, which looks at attractiveness of investment in mining around the world. And Chile has dropped from 2019 to 2020 in that rating. Now, that is a rating given by professionals in the business. It's not necessarily scientific, but it does include ratings. And I noted the rating had dropped from 17th to 30th out of 77 respondents in 1 year. And when I looked at the reasons they gave, they said reasons that this rating dropped were the country's political stability, which is part of our discussion now, the social outbreak protests of 2019, the taxation regime, and security. So I just wanted to mention that first of all, at a very high level, to say that's the perception from some of the investment community that's out there and the companies that are out there. But then what is the current situation? You're right, I have been working in Chile for 15 years. I was working in Patagonia, I've been working in Santiago, I've been working in northern Chile, I've also worked in Peru. And I've worked on underground and open pit mining. And anything we work on in mining, as I believe everyone on the call will know, all projects, all operations are totally linked to the local context. And the local context in Chile is highly, highly varied. If we compare, say, Calama to Coyhaique, where some of us have worked, and say, what is the difference between these regions? And tremendous difference in terms of neighbors, geography, geology, topography, climate, all those factors, and those really influence local impacts and help to show who the local stakeholders need to be. So we say in Chile, we talk the north, many of the operations in mining are isolated from communities, many of them, not all, quite isolated, and usually way up in high elevations. In the central region, some of these operations are very close to communities. And right out my window here in Santiago, I can see the backside of Los Bronces mine, for example, pretty much the back part of that mountain. And then in the south, well, smaller operations, which can be near rural communities, where I lived actually for 5 years at a small mine next to rural communities. And so the context is as varied as the geography. I think we have to look at two particular groups to comment on as well in your question, which you raised. One was, I know you'd asked me earlier about the indigenous population and how that is influenced or influencing mining as well. We know that the indigenous population in Chile is about 1.5 million total indigenous groups. And we know that that's distributed in some 9 identified indigenous groups. And more than 80% is Mapuche, which is in the south. So not necessarily close to major mining operations. But in the north, there are certainly local indigenous population influences on mining operations and projects. We can give examples if you wish. We know that up in the lithium deposit area, for example, we've seen that, and as well around AMSA, Antofagasta Minerals, Los Pelambres, etc. So local context, again, influences who the stakeholders are. And in terms of the actual sort of broad Chilean population, um, the how many? I would ask the question more. Maybe I want to pose a question to say, outside of the mining world, how many Chilenos really know how important mining is to Chile and its economy? We have 10% of GDP estimated from mining. I think the estimate of employment today is around 3% direct. If we add indirect employment, it gets closer to 10% of total employment in Chile. And we'd say, and yet, how many people of the average Chilenos, and I do my own personal surveys on this, informal surveys, really know how important that is in Chile? And it's not that high in my opinion. What does that create? To me, that creates opportunities and risks. And we talk about risk management. We also want to talk about opportunities. The opportunity is that we can educate people about mining. We can help them understand how it works, how important it is, how much it can support the local community and the region and the country. The risk is that if it's nearby and people don't understand it, it creates risk. It creates high risk, and it can create opposition. And so the types of opposition, if I can add to end my response to your question, what kind of opposition have we seen and what may happen in the future? Some of the mining projects that I've been reviewing and that we've seen opposition, there are many, many types of opposition that can arise in Chile, including in one particular case I was looking at, church leaders, local non-government groups, the media, water users, agricultural operators, tourism, in many cases, local scientists or local professionals, indigenous groups, and the average resident. And what are the processes that come in? Legal. Legal is a big player in Chile, much more so than in Peru, for those of us who worked in Peru as well, much more so. And the regulatory approvals, the protests on the street, media campaigns, all of these things can arise. So in view of all that, though, what would I say, maybe in my opinion, from what I've seen over the last 15 years, might be the possible collision courses or the challenges to mining investors and operators going forward? I had 5 to mention. The first one, of course, is climate change and water availability. Just in general, water availability. Everybody, I believe, understands that we are in climate change and that it's influencing water availability. The second one is, and Rony will touch this in a moment, the new constitution and what's coming. And we don't know what's coming, but we know that there's a greater environmental consciousness that's going to be incorporated in that. And there's attention on water rights. And there will be attention on other items as well, which I'm sure Rony will comment on. A third one is some of the proposed laws that are being discussed. And John, you already mentioned in a week or a couple of weeks, we'll have the coffee chat on the glacier law. That's one of them. It's been under discussion for many years, and it's got a very important potential influence on mining operations, actual and future. Also the use of ocean water, a requirement to use ocean water, desalinated or not, for new mining operations. That's another law that's been discussed. That may be inevitable, but from a mining company point of view, that's a high cost item. And there may be an unlimited source of water, that's correct, but there's also a tremendous cost for treatment, pumping, and handling. And I guess one of the high points I wanted to mention at the end of all this in terms of collision courses is really the community awareness now of the power of mobilization. I mean, we saw this, of course, in 2019, triggered by what seemed to be a very small event, but really unleashed a tremendous social outpouring in Chile. Over 1 million people in the streets. Every Friday, still people in Plaza Baquedano. Where did it start? In my view, some of this started quite a few years ago with Hydro-Sen. If you remember Hydro-Sen, some of you will, the hydro project that was proposed for Patagonia, and I lived in Patagonia at the time. This resulted in social mobilization around the country, and there were thousands of people marching in Santiago against Hydro-Sen, and they did have an influence on the stages of approval of that project, and it is currently stopped. The social uprising, which we mentioned, of course, and then on a more local scale, we have other mobilizations that influence projects. And if we wish, we can go to details. I don't want to go into them now, but we've had specific examples around Chile of local mobilization that has influenced media attention, public attention, attention of politicians, and in some cases has influenced the outcome of projects. So that was kind of a long answer, but I guess what I'd like to say, John, is that in general, all of this influences costs to mining companies. So it influences investment decisions. We know that costs are going up. of mining in general. Why? Because the grades are going down, especially if we look at copper. The average grade has dropped for the average copper mine. I think all the copper produced in Chile today is dropped by almost 50% in the last 12 years. And so we have to mine double the ore to get the same copper, right? That's one thing. The cost of water, cost of obtaining and maintaining water for any mining operation, which is always needed, despite the fact that all mining operations recycle as much as possible. The last ones I worked on are recycling upwards of 90% of the water they use, but they still need water, of course. And then there are the social agreements, the community agreements, and the costs that are associated with that may be elevated as we go forward based on some of those collision course items that I mentioned. And then which Rony may add to if we start to talk about this discussion of a royalty that's now trying to make its way through the legislature. So I guess it's a kind of a long answer, but I hope it's reasonable to try to approach the question that you raised, and I'm happy to expand on any of those points as we go forward. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Norman. I think what's really interesting is where your conversation began, which is mining is out of sight and out of mind for most Chileans. And the benefits of that are not recognized by most, certainly urban voters, even though it's the exports and the generation of foreign currency that strengthens the Chilean peso, that gives them the purchasing power that allows them to live the standard of lifestyle and consume imported products the way they do. This is where, one of the things that mining really contributes. But again, what's clear, and this is not alone in Chile, but the mining industry in general has not been the loudest voice talking about the industry. There are many more voices, and most of them are against mining, that are dominating the airwaves. And I think that so long as that remains the case, it becomes a real PR challenge for the industry.
Can I make
Rony,
a very quick comment about
please.
that, what you just said too? When I did my research over the last few days, I was looking at a lot of sources. And I want to say that the Consejo Minero has this tremendous publication, which you may have seen, called Mining by the Numbers. And it does really show very quickly and very graphically some of these numbers that I'm talking about. It's very powerful, and it's great for education at any level. But you're absolutely right about the average person not knowing, especially in the large communities. If we talk about the region of Antofagasta, the GDP of that region is about 50% mining. So we can guess that the people live there understand. But I would say my neighbors in Santiago, I know they don't understand that. I know they don't, despite my efforts. Thank you.
And it's precisely that lack of understanding and lack of imbalance of positive versus negative news that makes this year so important, because it is urban citizens going to the polls that are going to decide Chile's future, including the mining industry. And before I ask Rony a question, I want to very quickly, on the next slide, just project the latest polling data for the October presidential election. And Andreas, if you're there and you can move the slide. I'm not going to go into the details of each candidate, but I'm just going to make a sweeping remark. In the 30 years that I've studied Latin American markets, one thing has always held true. When income disparity grows over a period of time, people question the status quo of essentially pro-business politics and gravitate towards populism. And the last 12 months during the pandemic has done more to worsen the distribution of income across all of Latin America, including Chile, than any event in my 30 years of studying the region. And so it's no surprise that we have leading the pack some candidates that are certainly populist by nature. They may be vague in their policy making, but they are populist. And this is, of course, an existential threat to the sort of business establishment in Chile, including the mining industry. So, Rony, you put on a very impressive webinar recently with BN Americas, where you talked about Chile's experiment with writing a new constitution and how that might impact the mining sector. Are you or the miners that you advise worried about this constitutional convention process and how it might impact mining, and why is that exactly, or why isn't that a concern for you? And what specifically are the rules that are likely to change for the mining industry?
It's a softball, but it's such a huge question, and it's hard to pick where to answer, where to enter the reply, because there's so many different places from where to start responding to that. First of all, I think it's important for everybody to understand that, notwithstanding the general effect that a constitutional revision and constitutional convention can have on the general political and economic structure of a country, in Chile, that's even more relevant, because unlike many other countries, mining is regulated expressly in the Constitution. So any modification to the Constitution immediately can affect mining, not as a secondary effect because of the way it structures the general economic and political structures of the country, but because it directly regulates, in a way, the mining rights which exist. So, yes, the Chile's experiment in drafting a new constitution is something that clearly raises questions for investment in mining, and there are questions that we've received from all types of clients in the mining sector and in other sectors. Now, with respect to mining, I think what is very interesting is that Chile has generally, what Chile's greatest asset, I would say, that it has had in the last 20 to 30 years, and which has been a boom to the local economy, to the mining industry, et cetera, has been not its actual resources, but its political stability and structures. So it's a combination of those two things which have allowed it to actually become, to increase to become the world leader in copper mining, and also a leader in other aspects of mining as well. So the fact that that's been, the safe haven in Latin America for investors, both in junior mining and in multinationals, et cetera, has been, Chile's a stable environment. It has long-term tax structures, which we know. It's got the non-variability with respect to taxes. It has a very stable political structure with two main governing sectors, and there was this kind of consensus that existed in Chile, which allowed investors to feel comfortable coming into Chile and knowing that, notwithstanding the fact that there may be some bureaucracy that doesn't exist in other jurisdictions, and that things may take a while, and that et cetera, but that Chile is a stable country, and we can count on it. And so if we find good mineral prospects there, that we can, with confidence and with safety, project our projects over the long term. Now, that's clearly something that's been rattled a little bit over the past couple of years, or the past year and a half, because of the initial social uprising which occurred in October of 2019, which came not only as a shock to the international investing community, but embarrassingly to the country itself. I mean, the politicians, a week before this happened, the president of Chile was promoting Chile as this oasis within Latin America because of its stability, and a week later, you've got the largest riots that have occurred in the history of Chile. So this happened because, well, I mean, there's many possible reasons, but clearly the underlying reason was that there wasn't, or part of the underlying reasons was there wasn't a sensitivity to the discrepancy and the inequalities that were being generated as the economy was growing. So you had a growing economy that was probably helping some more than others, and that those continually expanding differences created this kind of this breaking point where the large part of the population wanted to participate in the benefits that the copper industry, amongst others, was creating for Chile. So this, my understanding and the way I see this is that the constitutional modification was one way of quelling social unrest. I don't think that it in any way addresses many of the issues that came up in this process, but it was a way that the whole political class could get together and say, okay, let's address this situation. So that fissure in the existing stability that Chile traditionally had clearly creates some concerns with respect to long-term investments, and where is this constitutional process taking us? So I think the effect in the understanding of investors with respect to what the constitutional process will mean for Chile and for its investing was the concerns came down a little bit once the violence subsided and this social unrest was channeled into a relatively smooth constitutional reform process. There was an initial vote last year to see if the country agreed to undertake this constitutional reform, and then there was an election period within which one had to choose the participants that were going to participate in the Constitutional Convention, which was just recently postponed due to COVID. But that also has generally gone along a very Chilean way of doing things, which was, they put the violence in general aside and it channeled the efforts back into a political discussion, relatively violence-free, a lot of debate in the press and obviously on social media, et cetera, which has been well channeled. So I think the concerns with respect to the investment community also say, well, look, Chile has these issues. It's been a stable country for 20 to 30 years. It's had a good regime, and now it's channeling these legitimate concerns of the population into a new constitutional process. So I think that calmed down the nerves that existed. And one factor that we should have seen by now, but was postponed due to COVID, was that last week we were supposed to have the convention, the vote on who was going to participate in this convention. Unfortunately, that was postponed, but that would have given us a much better idea of the temperature of what was going to come up in the Constitutional Convention, because if many delegates to that convention were designated who were from more extreme points of view, then that would be of a concern. And if there was more of a traditional center consensus with respect to the participants that were elected, then that would have given us a more stable perspective. But the fact is that's been postponed, and the polls that I've seen with respect to what's going to happen and who's going to be voted on have not been clear, in my point of view. I think that there is a concern that there is a more left view, or the candidates which have a more left view are doing better in the polls with respect to the nomination for the Constitutional Convention, but that's to be seen. Also, the structure of the Constitutional Convention is established such that you really need over 2/3 majority to establish new constitutional rules. So there's kind of a veto, a control, so that this doesn't get out of hand and establish rules that really are unmanageable. With that, and not to take too much time, but I think the focus on this constitutional reform is not mining, or has not been mining. Mining is clearly, as Norman and you mentioned, John, mining is in the consciousness of Chileans, but not in the way that it should be, and the benefits that it brings to Chile, but as something which is being poorly managed by the governments of Chile historically, by permitting foreign companies to extract minerals and not pay the corresponding benefits to the Chilean communities. So they don't see the upside, they see a lot of the downside, and that's been the populist measure for a long time. But in this much more in the forefront of this constitutional conversation has been environmental rights, water rights, and indigenous rights. And so those items I have absolute certainty will be addressed directly in this new constitution. The current water regime in Chile will be amended, and so that will make things different, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing for mining. I think mining has to take a new tax with respect to water consumption and use, and establishing these general rules is not necessarily bad, as long as you have fixed rules that you can rely on. The focus of the new constitution on the environment, I think, will be a holistic approach. I mean, there's a lot, even all aspects of the candidates understand that the environment is going to play a much greater role in the Chilean constitution and in the approval and revision of every project going forward. Again, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing for Chilean mining, but what has to happen is that the Chilean mining regulatory system needs to be improved. And that's not something that's a problem in the constitutional modification that may come up. It's a problem right now in Chile. In Chile, you have, in some cases, very reasonable environmental rules, but the institutions that are established to approve them and approve projects and allow the process to go on are excessively bureaucratic and are not functioning the way they should be and are difficult. So again, a revision in the constitution with respect to environmental issues is not necessarily bad. We have to see how that plays out and establishes a long-term framework that the country can rely on. And the other matter is, again, indigenous rights and communities in Chile who already have a very active role over the past 10, 15 years in the approval of projects, larger scale and even smaller scale projects, through their various legal resources that they have at their hand, including ILO 169, the UN Convention, which is applicable in Chile as law, through their roles in the environmental approval process where they have specific rights to participate in those. And that's going to be, I think, given much more power and it'll be much more robust in the new constitution. Currently in the Chilean constitution, indigenous communities are not recognized individually. There's just there's rights to Chilean citizens and the human beings that live in Chile, but they aren't individually designated. There's no special recognition to local indigenous communities. And I think that's clearly going to change in the new constitution, and that will be a factor that will, that again, it'll depend on how that plays out, on if it's done responsibly or if it's done in a populist way. So to sum up, I think that the traditional stable view that investors have had with respect to Chile has clearly been shaken a little bit with respect to the violence that occurred in 2019, early 2020, the amendments that can come to the Constitution. But I think Chile has done a relatively good job of channeling that social concerns and seeing if we can channel that into a better social pact for everybody. And we'll have to see. There's no question that that's going to bring challenges to the mining industry, and we'll have to see if those things can be compatible.
Rony, thank you for that. Before I ask a follow-up question, I want to remind everyone that your questions are welcome. And the easiest way to manage that is for you to write your questions into the chat mode directed to everyone. And I'll be sure to ask our panelists to address that. Rony, there's been a recent development. I understand it is a congressional legislative initiative to raise royalty. I'm not sure if it's on all mining or just copper of 3%. And I've been told this is not constitutionally valid because the Congress doesn't have the power of the purse, I guess, the same way that, or taxation laws specifically have to originate from the executive. Can you first of all, correct me if I'm wrong in that interpretation, and secondly, give us your interpretation of what this initiative means, how likely it is to pass, and if it doesn't pass, is it a precedent that might worry people?
Sure. First of all, let me state that I'm not a constitutional lawyer nor a tax lawyer, but I can know enough to speak on this point. There are certainly okay, so what is the proposal? The proposal is a 3% ad valorem tax only on copper and lithium. So it's not on all mining, it's on those specific resources. So the proposal right now, which was approved by the Congress, is a very small, it's a paragraph long, it's not a developed law, so there's not a real understanding of of how the law may eventually be finally formed. It was approved by the Congress, but then it has to go into the Senate for approval and general discussion and definitions. My understanding, and I think this is correct, is that there's a definite constitutional issues with respect to the this law for the matters that you raised, because of the power of the purse that has to initiate from the executive branch and not from the legislative branch. And there's also issues with respect to expropriation rights and other things, because this isn't really a tax per se. This is it's questionable whether under our constitution it can the government can institute a royalty of this, because this is a traditional royalty. We're off every ton of mineral that's extracted. There's a certain price based on the market price that has to be paid to the government. So that's not really a tax. Taxes have to do with revenues, et cetera, and income, and it's a different structure. So this has various challenges, and I don't think it's going to go anywhere. What it is a reflection of the popular fervor, which is also related to the constitutional debate, to the social unrest that we saw, and it has to do with the Chilean, a large part of the Chilean public seeking more resources to cover basic needs such as health, education, pensions, etc. And they see the mining industry as a deep pockets where this can come from, and they see countries such as Australia, Canada, and other countries which have royalties, and they say, well, those countries haven't fallen apart, we should have this as well. And so that's as sophisticated as the argument has been right now. There's, that's where it is. So I think that the political or the public support for such a measure does exist. And I think that there's been many, that there will be larger opposition from certain politicians and from the industry to try and not expand, not create a royalty of this kind. But I do think I would not be surprised if either in the future in the Constitution amendments are made to allow for this type of structure to exist, or in a new government which comes in, there will be a structure made where they turn the existing royalty which exists in Chile, which is not an ad valorem tax, but kind of a surcharge over excessive profits in certain mining projects, to make that royalty which currently exists even stronger, or which makes that current tax stronger. So my impression is that taxation on Chilean mining projects in the midterm will increase. And I think that, along with the constitutional debate, is going to have, is going to increase the mix of concerns and factors which make attractiveness or the projects locally attractive, just as water rights are, indigenous concerns, grades, etc. So it's one more item that will be thrown into this mix, but it's definitely making the waters a little bit murkier. And sorry, just to finish this, I think, in my opinion, from discussions that I've had over many years with different clients, it's not the immediate effect of the tax that really, it's the specific rate. It's whether this will be the rule that they can understand will be applicable to the project over the long term, because of the long-term nature of many projects.
Excellent, thank you. Norman, I think you wanted to add your thoughts on this.
Yeah, just a little bit. Thanks, John and Ronnie. No, in terms of the 3% concept, I just did want to add that it does relate to what I mentioned earlier, the general awareness of the importance of mining, and also how it really works in Chile. And the fact that the money that does come into the coffers from the private and public is enormous. And yet it's such an easy hot button issue to get into the press. And all of a sudden there's, we should increase a royalty, and look how much copper is worth now. And I would encourage folks to look at the Tsunami website as well as Cochilco, particularly Tsunami, and look at some of the press releases they've had out on this. It helped to educate, but that's education of the mining community. And there is a challenge there. And as Ronnie said, it's also the water rights thing, return water to the people. We've heard this in the last while. You see billboards in the South on that front, quite a few. I know, what do you mean return it to the people? It's like, some people understand that water rights are private and that they're owned by companies. And yet, so something has to change there, as Ronnie's saying. It can't be retroactive, but something new like the 3%. Well, that's got a selling power to it, and it's concerning. I agree with Rony. It's something that has to be properly communicated. I did notice also that the Minister of Mining spoke out against it today or yesterday, which is in the Mining Journal. Very interesting to see. But the water rights, 3% royalty mining, and also glaciers. Glaciers, another hot button issue that people can say, oh, the glaciers are disappearing. We have to protect them. And so we have to be careful around these issues. It's true. And they can affect the investment attractiveness of Chile
Right.
due to the uncertainty, is what I wanted to say. Thanks.
So to you both, and I want to remind our audience, please write your questions that you may have or comments into the chat mode, and we'll be sure to address them. But let me ask you both, you're in conversations with miners. What are they telling you privately about their plans? Are they planning to hold off and wait and see what happens with the Constitutional Convention, that see what happens with the elections at the end of the year? Do they want to wait and see? And if they are waiting and putting their plans on hold, what signals are they looking for that would encourage them to resume their plans?
Rony, go ahead, and then I'll add if you wish.
Sure. Look, I think it has to do, I think it depends on the project, the type of project. I think it depends on the type of company, and I think it depends on the stage that they're at. If you are a larger project that's got it already has your environmental approvals ready and you're just waiting for funding to go, I think those projects may be, and for at least comments that we've received have been, let's hold off until we see exactly what's coming. But those projects are at a much more advanced stage. I think if you're in an exploration stage and you're looking at a much shorter cycle on results with respect to your geology and the drill program that you're involved in right now, and the current and the specific, limited time project, I think those we have not heard comments with respect to concerns in this nature. Concerns have been much more related to COVID, have been related to water, indigenous matters. It's much more of a short-term interest, and it makes sense for that to be the case. So I think it depends on the project, but clearly questions have been raised. I personally have not had any client that has stopped going forward. And I also know of various larger projects which have continued going forward in the interim while this process is going on. Because I said, Chile's got this asset of a long-term trust that, well, these are things that happen in different countries, and we trust that things are going to work out. But clearly, there have been certain projects, larger projects, which are waiting until at least until the constitutional nominees are designated, because to wait until the whole process is complete is really too long. Because what you're not going to have a clear constitution, a new constitution in Chile for another 2 years. So I think, but certainly there is an element of pause in certain ready to finance projects that have been approved.
Yeah, John, if I can add, thanks, Rony, as well. The decisions are so long-term with the big projects, is true. And the projects that I worked on, which had any 10 to 15 years of planning, followed by 5 years of construction and 30 to 40 or 50 years of operation, those decisions, once they're made to proceed in construction, it seems exceedingly unlikely they would be stopped, and I haven't seen any stop at that scale. The smaller investments, of course, could be slowed down or stopped. That is true. But going back to something else that Rony said at the beginning, the country has been, in terms of its investment climate, transparent. We are mature. We have a mature legal system. It's a stable country. And I believe that because of the management of the social uprising and the transition to the constitutional reform process, which has been discussed, that has demonstrated that the country continues to be stable. Now, COVID may have helped by preventing demonstrations. That's true. It's been a strange combination of events. But I listened to a session from the U.S. Embassy recently on investment in Chile as well. And they highlighted the quality of Chile's response to that uprising compared to things that have happened around the world. given several examples around the world, of course, which we have some that are underway right now. They're always underway in the world. And really the point was made, the country has managed this. And the country has a process in place and it will be managed. Now, what'll come out? Things will cost more. There's just no doubt about it. Nothing will be cheaper. I can't see anything that will be cheaper. The grades will be lower. The water will be more expensive. The social agreements will be greater. Maybe there'll be more taxation. Everything will change the cost. But meanwhile, the copper demand keeps going up. Mines keep closing and more copper is needed. So look at projects like Quellaveco in southern Peru, which I worked on, being built. It's going to run. Quebrada Blanca too. These projects or expansions of projects, they will go ahead because the copper demand is there. I am referring only to copper when I say that. Lithium is a very special case, but also the demand for lithium is projected to be tremendous. So, and looking at stable countries in the region, what could be more stable in comparison to, comparison to say Peru and Bolivia is Chile. So I guess I believe, as Rony had said too, that the decisions are long-term and they have to go ahead. And there could be some delays or some concern, it's true, in the boardrooms, in the investment community, it's true. I believe that the effect will be manageable and it will be cost. Maybe in some cases things will be stopped completely, I can't say. But what I can see so far is more like a matter of financial aspects to companies for the quality of their investment. Thank you.
So what I'm hearing is dropping yields, higher compliance costs, rising water costs, possibly a longer licensing process, particularly if a concession touches upon indigenous lands, which will be redefined and probably more robustly mapped. Is this going to mean that projects have to be larger and therefore only large mining companies can afford to develop projects in Chile versus 5-10 years ago? And if projects have to be larger, doesn't that run against some of these concerns around water use and land use in general? What does this mean for mid-size mining companies trying to make it in Chile?
You would like me to add something to that, John? I'd like to say, I think, first of all, just go back a little bit to water use. Every mining company is doing all they can to reduce water use. And some of the companies are investing in reduced water use operations. I don't see much tendency for water use to be reduced much more, except to say that it will be managed as much as possible. And some of these projects, which are the bigger ones, there will be almost an expectation that the ones that are anywhere close to a coastline will have to use seawater. So that'll be a cost item again. In terms of comparing medium to large, I don't really know how to do that exactly in this conversation. Maybe Rony can add to that.
Sure. I think the issue that you raised, John, is an issue that Chile's had a problem with for a long time now. Chile has had lower exploration projects for the past 10, 15 years. It has if you look at the size of projects in Chile relative to other jurisdictions, Chile's got a much large scale, a much greater percentage of the mining production is done by larger projects than mid and small projects. And that has to do with many factors, including the ones that you mentioned, that have existed, the licensing costs, the whole process that favors larger projects over smaller ones. And a lot of it has to do also with the concession system in Chile, which is not a good concession system. In my opinion, it doesn't have what other jurisdictions have, such as a use it or lose it, or where you have to actually work the project in order to maintain your concession. The concession costs are relatively cheap, which allows a major company to just carpet areas with concessions, have a relatively low investment, and not use them. Whereas a smaller, more dynamic entity would try and investigate the concession, develop it, and if it doesn't work out, then it would lose the concession. So I think that's an issue in Chile that it already exists, as far as particularly in copper, not so much in gold. So yes, that's a challenge for the Chilean structure, and in fact we've presented certain papers and participated on panels prior to the constitutional issues with respect to how to improve the Chilean environment for smaller and mid-sized projects. I think that's
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions. I'm going to recouch them in a different light as a sort of challenge to each of you, as maybe this would be your final remarks. Given all of the risks or the likelihood of changing regulations around three hot button issues: environment, water, indigenous rights, the specter of higher taxation, how it comes into law remains to be seen. Given all that, if each of you were hired by the sort of mining sector, by the association representing the industry, in what could be very intense negotiations of redefining the operating environment with the next government, what would be your advice to the mining sector in terms of what you need to what changes you need to embrace and which ones you need to fight? What arguments can be made to strengthen your position and where you need to be ready to concede? How would you advise the mining sector generally in this environment?
Rony, do you want to start? Or as you wish.
Sure. I think a lot of the question on how to advise a mining investor into Chile don't change so much with respect to the current situation. It has to do with in Chile generally, if you historically, if you do the work correctly in a play by the rules, start in a very early stage conversations with all the players that are involved, be it the regulators, the indigenous communities, etc., then things generally should go. If you've got a good project, things should go well. What doesn't work in Chile is kind of off the cuff arrangements, which can work in other jurisdictions, where you can make a quick arrangement with a government entity to approve your project because it looks attractive to that entity at that moment, to make a quick arrangement with the local community because they suddenly see that there's funding available and that can improve the situation. That type of kind of environment, which is less structured and more kind of creative, I guess, and on the cuff, I think that works less in this environment, and that's always been the case here in Chile. So I think that now it's even more so, where you're going to have more controls and more eyes on these projects. So you come in well prepared to discuss your projects at an early stage with the regulatory authorities, with the communities, and with the local investment community as well. I think that would be my initial advice. Not that, the technical side is something that the companies already have seen with respect to the grades, the project possibilities, the water access, etc. Those are things that they already come with knowledge to.
Every project or every expansion of an operation is unique. So every situation is unique, and so the stakeholders will be unique in every single case. We know certain ones that will always be there, but others will appear, and we need to know who they are in advance. But the triangle of acceptability of a project, workability, starts at the top with the technical and economic. You have to have a deposit, it has to be economic to exploit. That we start there. Without that, there's nothing. And then we go into the property, the permits, the approvals. We need those. So we need the property. We need to have the permits. We need to have all the approvals. And then we need the social license. And those bottom two pillars, or the bottom two corners of the triangle, in my view, are all what we call ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And all that stuff is something I've been working in with enterprise risk management to say, work with a company early and say, what are the risks that you're seeing in that arena? What are they today? What do you think they could be? What are the ones that you don't want to talk about, but you know they're there? Identify those risks and then identify the controls that you may have to manage them, or in some cases where you can't manage them. So you have to manage them by having to adapt to them. And that's about being resilient. And as Rony says, you don't want to just say, well, I'm going to change my plan tomorrow. But if something new emerges, a new player, a new person running for office, okay, a new professional who appears on the scene, a new study, a new something or other. You have to be resilient enough to respond to it. And I've been working with some others around other parts of the world on this to say, how do you get ready for that? How do you make your company resilient? One of the ways you do it is by you identify the people who can respond to that in your company or in your consulting team, your owner's team, and say, let's think about the controls we have for that. So you don't want to change things overnight, but you want to be ready to adapt. That would be my message. And so we know these things are coming. We've identified the hot button issues, and we can maybe identify a few more. We have 3 or 4 right now, and say, good, we know those are coming. So let's talk about those up front. Not when we get to the stage of saying, will we approve or not approve the funding for this project? That's too late. We want to talk about it now in terms of a project cycle, in my view. Thank you.
So let me come back to you both very quickly. In Peru, when Humala was elected, he was elected, part of his campaign promise was to raise taxation on mining. It was a period of high pricing for most minerals. And the Peruvian industry came together quite effectively. Today it's structured behind a couple of key organizations, and it was really 7 or 8 big companies that kind of brought a council of speakers and then nominated sort of 1 or 2 to lead those negotiations. How does Chile bring its industry together to talk to government, which may be a government starting next year that is quite aggressive against mining and wants to make changes? How does the industry come together and educate voters? Is that structure in place? How effective is it, and where does it need to be improved so that the industry as a whole improves its position in this electoral environment?
I think that's a very difficult question, John. I think it's a huge challenge in Chile for the things for the reasons that Norman and I have mentioned. In the general public, there's a stigma again that mining is taking the mining companies take advantage of the natural resources and don't leave sufficient benefits for the local public. I mean, that's a characterization. That's not exactly a very subtle way of referring to it, but I think generally one can see that that's the way that the public views it. So it's difficult. Now, Chile does have excellent mining industry groups like the Consejo Minero, the Tsunami, and others that are doing a good job of trying to show the benefits that exist to the country and the risks that are involved with all these different factors occurring at the same time. Of the constitutional issues, the royalty issues, the general environmental issues that are making mining more challenging because of global climate change and the lack of water, et cetera. So I think, so Chile has good industry leaders, but there's a history of over hundreds of years of an understanding of how the mining industry works and the benefits that it provides to the government. So it's a big challenge. I think what's necessary is responsible politicians as well, trying not to take the quick populist view, but taking a long-term approach to seeing how mining can help provide a benefit to these really legitimate social needs that exist in Chile, but without kind of, as they say, killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. That question I don't have an answer for. I think it's one of the most challenging questions right now, how to socialize that concern to the Chilean public. If I can just add one thing with respect to that, and sorry to dominate a little bit of the time. I remember something that the ex-minister of the economy said, Rodrigo Valdez. He said, look, Chile let's not be so concerned about a public effort to try and amend the laws and democratize the current situation, because notwithstanding the fact that we had the rules that everybody likes, the non-variability, the constitutional protections to mining investment that were established in the early 80s, the mining investment really started in Chile in the 90s when the democratic government came into power. So one thing is to have the rules, and the other thing is to also have the social approval social legitimacy to the mining. And I think those two things can happen. If this is well done under the Constitutional Convention, where you can have reasonable rules that are now granted social legitimacy, I think that would be very good as a next boom for the Chilean structure.
I appreciate that positive end note there, Rony. Norman, any last thoughts before we?
Yeah, I know. I see we're almost over time, so I don't want to take too long. Just to say that it is all about communication. It's true. The information's out there. The industry associations, as Rony mentioned, Sonami, Consejo Minero. Sonami has 38 associations that are part of its membership, for example, around the country. The information's out there. But as we know, communication's the key. Good communication from the right people to the right people. And communication is two-way. Speak and listen. So we have to have the communication has to be two-way. And there is unfortunately a predisposition to disbelieve industry at times. That is true enough. So we have to work with that too, recognize that reality. And say the industry is speaking out against a royalty. What does that sound like? That doesn't always sound right. It sounds like, wait a minute, how can we change that messaging in some way to listen? Well, why is that being proposed and what's better? Because absolutely, mining has pulled millions of Chileans out of poverty over the years. It's doing the same thing in Peru today. We know that at a different scale, at a different rate. And I really don't know how many Chileans know this. So I start with communicating and around my neighborhood and with my neighbors, but we need to think about who are the ambassadors for that communication. And I believe it has to be broader than the industry associations and the companies themselves. We have to think about how to expand that ambito and make it bigger, make those who are communicating a larger group. I've worked on that in other companies. It's not a simple answer, but it is possible. It is possible.
Right, great.
Thanks very much.
Well, no, thank you. Norman and Rony, thank you both very much. It was not surprisingly a robust conversation, plenty to talk about, and you two brought superb experience and insight to the conversation. I want to thank everybody who joined us today, including the fact that we went a little over time. And I want to remind you that we will continue our coffee chats May 4th, specifically around glacier laws. And so look out for that invitation. Specifically, we'll be looking at Argentina and Chile. This is a big issue impacting the industry in both countries. And I think doing a comparative analysis and inviting panelists from both countries will prove an interesting conversation. So looking forward to that. And we look forward to your questions and comments and any follow-up discussions that we can have with you. We'll see you soon. Thank you.